Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 30 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, let's see. I've got a number of things to talk about in this episode of Camera Position. First of all, again, thank you so much for those of you who have written in and let me know that you're out there. It's always interesting to know where people are from and what they're doing with Camera Position and how they're enjoying it. An interesting development is that I've been invited to be a member of a new network of photography podcasts, the photocastnetwork.com. Photocastnetwork.com is a group of seemingly from the list of podcasts that they've got there now, some of the better ones that are out there. So, of course, I'm flattered to be asked to join. And, the Radiant Vista and Tips from the Top Floor and the Candid Frame, all of those guys are doing some really nice stuff with the podcast deal on photography. So I am very pleased to be part of that network. So check them out. You'll hear a little bumper at the bottom of the show here, and you'll also hear, or also see rather, a link to them on the cameraposition.com blog page. So let me know what you think and whether this kind of cross-promotional thing is a good idea, because I, of course, would like to have more people listening, and this seems to be a neat way to be able to do it. Well, the idea for today's podcast comes from a listener, actually, and I've gotten some great ideas from listeners, and I'm going to be taking you guys up on these things because I think there are some really neat things that people are asking about. And Stephen Durbin is a listener who had written to me and said that he was really enjoying the podcast and was going back through all of the podcasts, and that I had mentioned about my own work adjusting tonalities and preparing a print, and he'd like to hear more about the types of aesthetic decisions that I make in darkroom work, whether traditional or digital. And he's, of course, then goes on to say, and we're looking at one of his pictures if you're seeing the podcast in iTunes or on an iPod, and I'll put a link in the blog pages to his website. He's got some really interesting things going on. I especially like these woods photographs that he's made. But in any case, Stephen said, I know that you're not interested in doing a sort of technical thing in camera position, but certainly what you mentioned really would be the idea of how we adjust tones to adjust our personal vision of how the photograph should look. So I took Stephen up on his suggestion, and what I've done here is just prepared a photograph the way I would prepare it for printing. And I'm just going to go through this really quickly and talk about the kind of decisions that I have made in making this photograph and making the photograph look the way it looks. So this is a photograph that I made in a wonderful place, an absolutely magical place called Civita di Bagnoreggio. Civita di Bagnoreggio is an ancient, really ancient hill town in very extreme southern Umbria, and if those of you who may be watchers or listeners to Rick Steves, the travel geek kind of a guy, may know about Civita di Bagnoreggio. It's a very small town with about 8 or 9 inhabitants, and everyone who visits the town needs to walk across a footbridge, and I managed to be able to spend the night there this last summer, and there's a little tiny bed and breakfast for 4 rooms that's there. But when I arrived, I had walked up this long footbridge, so long that I didn't really want to carry the view camera and all the stuff up the footbridge, but by golly, I'm glad I did, because by the time I got to the top of the footbridge, what I found was the late afternoon sun raking across the surface of the town's church. And as you can imagine, it's a tiny little town, so it has actually a rather astonishingly beautiful church, especially beautiful inside, but such a small town that it only has one church. And there was a shadow being cast by another building. In fact, the building is the building that is casting the shadow is the building that I slept in a little bit later this evening. So I was intrigued by this idea of a shadow going across the building, and was really intrigued by the idea of perhaps making a photograph where the shadow was the predominant part of the image, and yet didn't really obscure the image very much at all. I was really liked the shape of the shadow, and I really liked the way in which the interplay of the round little rosette window and that arcing shadow worked, but also this sort of little broken up facade of the church, and how the facade is kind of peeling and changing over time. So I was really intrigued by that, and I started setting up the camera, and this was also one of those times, I'm setting up the camera, and suddenly I've got a flock of tourists around me asking me questions about the camera, like the light is moving, and I'm sure this has happened to you if you're been out photographing much. You're trying to get something to happen, and you really need to do it in a big hurry, and you know, people just don't quite understand what you're up to. But in any case, this is what I was looking at, was this church. And so I exposed the piece of film in such a way that I got shadow detail, and then developed it substantially less than I would normally develop. And again, I'm using black and white film and a 4x5 camera. And then because of that development choice and the exposure choice, I got a fairly long contrast range in the film, and good detail in the shadows, and still didn't block up the detail in the highlights. And yay, I got the technical part of photography right. So then the next step, of course, and those of you who've been listening along know that what I've been doing is scanning my negatives. So I scanned this piece of film, and I scanned it, and then began to adjust it. And what I wanted to do was adjust the shadow as dark as I possibly could adjust it without really kind of losing detail in that dark door. So I began to adjust in curves, and I use a lot of Photoshop stuff. I use a lot of curves in masks, though, in adjustment layers, so that I can paint in my adjustments. So I created this curve that made the entire image quite a bit darker, and from there I made another curve adjustment layer, where in this curve adjustment layer what I did is took and made the top part of the image quite a bit darker as well, so that I didn't have this sort of blaring light. And in fact, if I look back to the time that I made the photograph, what I could really think about is the fact that the light was very soft, and it was the end of the day, and I'd driven around quite a lot. I'd visited the town of Orvieto, which is not too far distant from this place, earlier in the day, and I'd made a lot of photographs there, and it was a beautiful, very quiet evening. There weren't very many people around, and I liked this idea of the softness of the light. It's not hard, it's not hard-edged, and it is on toward that end of the day, very soft, very quiet light. So that idea of not having the blaring highlight was important to me. The next bit was to make a little bit of visual interest in those dark areas by not allowing them to be these sort of dull thud dark areas. So I went back in with yet another curves adjustment layer, and bumped up some bright areas through a mask, so that I could have some areas that are lighter. And I didn't really want to make them really bright, but at the same time I didn't want them to be too dark. And again, my objective is to kind of bump up a little bit of a light value, especially in the lower left corner, to give the viewer's eye something to look at. And our eyes tend, in any kind of photography, black and white or in color, to move toward light values, light tones. And so I really wanted the viewer's eye to not forget about that lower left corner of the image, and spend some time down there. So I give them something to look at down there by kind of taking advantage of what the negative already gave me by making those areas a little bit lighter. The next step was to make some areas around the edge of the image a little bit darker. And the idea here is to make sure that the viewer's eye doesn't wander off the edge of the page a little bit, and also to make sure that that right side of the image, where there's both some visually interesting stuff and also some tonally bright stuff that I don't really want to take over a dominant position, make sure that those things don't get too light and stay dark enough to make some sense, in terms of concentrating the viewer's interest in the center of the picture, or at least in the sort of primary pictorial area of the picture. And then I continued that on by making sure that the bottom right corner of the picture was sufficiently dark to not make it look like, oh, look, there's some really light, beautiful things off to the right side. Because again, I wanted this sort of somber, very dark and kind of moody looking image. So that's that sort of walkthrough on that. And again, there was, just this very small window of time in which I made the photograph, and a few minutes later, after I shook off the pesky tourists, a few minutes later, those shadows disappeared, and there really wasn't the kind of reflected light coming into those shadows that kind of helped open them up a little bit. And the magic, the photographic magic was gone. So it, I think, is a successful photograph for me anyway. It's one that I like very much. And I'm actually, I'm planning on a next podcast being a little bit about sequencing of images, because it's something I've been thinking about quite a lot lately. I'm about to head off to a workshop and portfolio review in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in about a week and a half, and as I prepare for that, I'm thinking a lot about editing and a lot about sequencing, and so we'll talk about that in the next episode of Camera Position. I also wanted to mention something that those of you who are involved in the digital end of photography might be interested in knowing about. My day job as a college photography teacher is at College of DuPage in Glen Ellen, Illinois, and that position is a pretty interesting one. It's College of DuPage is that huge giant school that you've never heard of, 29,000 student community college just outside of Chicago, and we are one of 25 locations nationwide that have been chosen by Adobe to begin a sort of a rollout and instructional program about their new software product, Lightroom. And that's going to be happening next month, October 5th and 6th, on and around our campus. And if you were interested in learning more about what's going to happen, I would direct you to the website that Adobe has set up for this, and it's called projectphotoshoplightroom.com. projectphotoshoplightroom.com. And I'll have a link to that, as well as a link to the resource about the Photocast Network, and a link to all of the photographs that I've talked about this evening, all of the variations of those photographs in this episode of Camera Position will also be up on the cameraposition.com blog. So again, thanks to those of you who are writing to me. I really appreciate hearing from you. If I don't get back to you right away, it may be because I've run out of time, or in my busy life, or it may be because you've asked a question that's a little more complex for me to answer, and I want to give it the thought of making sure that I give you a good answer. But I do try to get back to everybody eventually, so if you don't hear back from me in a week or two, just chalk it up to I'll get to it. So I do really appreciate hearing from you. And I also appreciate those of you who have told other people about Camera Position. I can see by my my feed burner stats that the number of people who are listening is going up, and I appreciate those of you who are spreading the word about what we're doing here. And I would also ask you to keep spreading that word and letting people know that you're finding something interesting at cameraposition.com. And thanks again for listening to this podcast, and we'll leave you with the new, and let me know what you think of this, the new bumper for the Photocast Network, of which Camera Position is a proud member.
Photocastnetwork.com, your photography resource in the podosphere. Photocastnetwork.com